For 3 decades, Johnny Carson sat behind his Tonight Show desk and welcomed America's biggest stars into millions of homes. With his calm presence, sharp humor, and ability to make interviews feel effortless, Carson became the trusted face of late-night television. He created a space where celebrities felt relaxed enough to reveal real pieces of themselves, sometimes more honestly than they ever did anywhere else. The Tonight Show became a cultural landmark that shaped entertainment and reflected America's changing attitudes. And while the show was mostly light-hearted, that relaxed environment also revealed something more uncomfortable: the casual racism held by some of the most famous and beloved figures in American entertainment. As the United States slowly shifted its views on race, these celebrities often did not shift with it. Their unfiltered comments, jokes, or attitudes that slipped out on Carson's stage created a historical record of prejudices that many people would rather forget. Carson worked at a time when old Hollywood and new America were colliding. One former NBC executive explained that Johnny had to welcome long-established stars who built their careers when racist jokes and stereotypes were considered normal. At the same time, the country around him was becoming more aware, more sensitive, and more unwilling to accept racism as harmless entertainment. This created conflicting moments on air, where Carson was forced to balance respect for household names with growing awareness that some of those views were no longer acceptable. While Carson generally leaned toward progressive ideas for his era, his views were still limited by the standards of the time, and his approach to dealing with racist guests was subtle rather than confrontational. He almost never challenged anyone directly on live television, but experts note that his posture, tone, or emotional energy towards certain guests changed over time. The warmth sometimes faded. The charm became thinner. The laughs didn't come as easily. Carson rarely said anything openly, but attentive viewers could feel the shift. Among the most complicated figures to appear on The Tonight Show was John Wayne, the man who became the symbol of America's cowboy spirit. Wayne represented the rugged, patriotic masculinity that millions admired. His films portrayed him as fair, honorable, brave, and deeply moral. Because of that image, viewers assumed the real man shared those qualities. But Wayne's real opinions about race were far more troubling than his on-screen characters suggested. His infamous 1971 Playboy interview made headlines across the country and shocked many fans. In the interview, Wayne openly said he believed in white supremacy until the blacks are educated to a point of responsibility. This was not a vague comment or a misunderstood sentence. It was a direct declaration of racist belief from one of America's most iconic movie stars. He also defended European settlers taking land from Native Americans by saying the indigenous people were being selfish for trying to keep their own land. He dismissed complaints about racism in Hollywood and denied that minorities faced systemic barriers. Carson continued interviewing Wayne after that interview became public, but their dynamic was different. Old clips show Carson being polite and respectful, but less comfortable, less playful, and less eager to bond with him. Their earlier interviews had warmth and easy banter, but the post-interview appearances felt more staged and distant. Carson never directly addressed the Playboy comments. It wasn't his style to confront older stars he admired, but the emotional shift was hard to miss for anyone paying attention. Wayne never said explicitly racist things on Carson's show, but the shadow of his public statements hung over every appearance. Carson's subtle distancing showed the growing gap between the values of old Hollywood and the changing expectations of American viewers. Bob Hope presented a different challenge. He was one of the biggest comedy stars the country had ever seen, a man with decades of experience entertaining audiences through radio, film, television, and his beloved USO shows for American troops. People saw him as harmless, patriotic, and grandfatherly. But Hope's early comedy career was filled with racist routines, including blackface acts, exaggerated Asian accents, and jokes built entirely on stereotypes. This kind of humor was extremely common in the entertainment world he came from, and Hope never seemed to understand or accept that times had changed. When asked about the offensive material from his past, he brushed it off, saying it was simply what comedy was back then. He refused to apologize or acknowledge the hurt those jokes caused. Even into the 1970s and 80s, long after America began recognizing the harm of racial stereotypes, Hope occasionally slipped racial jokes into his televised roasts or Tonight Show appearances. Whenever he did, Carson reacted with the same subtle discomfort that had become his trademark response to outdated attitudes. He wouldn't laugh loudly. He wouldn't encourage the joke. Instead, he often forced a light smile and quickly moved on to the next topic. Carson respected Hope as a comedy pioneer, but he was also aware that Hope's humor reflected a past America was trying to leave behind. As the decades went on, Carson continued to encounter guests who carried prejudices that no longer matched the growing awareness of the country. Some of these prejudices came out in jokes, others in small comments, and others in more direct statements that were almost shocking to modern ears. But Carson's style remained consistent. He never shouted anyone down. He never publicly humiliated a guest. Instead, his disapproval showed up in quiet, almost invisible ways: tighter smiles, shorter responses, faster transitions, or even skipping over certain subjects entirely. It became a delicate dance between not wanting to embarrass a guest and not wanting to endorse outdated or ugly beliefs. Another category of problematic guests were comedians from the old school who believed shock humor or racial jokes were harmless entertainment. Many of them came from the same era as Hope, where almost every comedy stage in America relied heavily on stereotypes for laughs. Some of these comedians still tried to repeat their old routines on Carson's couch, expecting the host to laugh as they once did. But by the 1980s, Carson knew that the world was changing, and he often tried to steer these comedians towards safer topics. Sometimes he succeeded, but other times they insisted on sticking to the kind of humor that once made them stars but now made audiences uncomfortable. There were also actors who appeared polished on screen but held tight to private prejudices off-screen. They viewed the civil rights movement as unnecessary or believed that minorities were demanding too much progress too quickly. When these actors slipped into casual racist remarks during conversations, Carson's reactions became even more telling. He would lean back, look down, or lightly tap his cards, giving subtle cues that he was distancing himself from the guest. These moments reveal how much The Tonight Show became an unexpected stage for America's racial tensions. One particularly uncomfortable category of guests were musicians and entertainers who grew up in segregated America and learned to see racist behavior as normal. They sometimes made comments that they thought were harmless, but which revealed deep prejudices that no longer had a place in modern society. Instead of directly confronting them, Carson did what he always did: use humor or a quick change of subject to diffuse awkwardness while refusing to encourage the harmful ideas. The Tonight Show also featured political figures whose racial attitudes were controversial even for their own eras. Some made bold statements about immigration, crime, or civil rights that reflected racial biases, and Carson often tried to gently push back without turning the show into a debate stage. His approach was to remain polite, neutral, and composed, but viewers today can see moments where Carson clearly disagreed with what was being said. Even sports figures sometimes revealed uncomfortable racial beliefs during interviews. Athletes with long careers in predominantly white institutions sometimes spoke about black players, Latino players, or foreign athletes in ways that reflected bias. Their comments weren't always intentionally hateful, but they exposed how deeply racism was built into the culture of many sports institutions. Carson handled these comments the same way he handled all others: quietly, subtly, and with a professionalism that allowed the show to move forward while still signaling discomfort. Through all these interactions, The Tonight Show ended up unintentionally recording America's racial evolution. It captured the end of an era where open racism was acceptable and the beginning of a new era where the country began expecting more empathy, more fairness, and more accountability. Watching Carson's old episodes today reveals how dramatically things have changed, both for better and for worse. It shows how celebrated entertainers could be deeply flawed, how beloved heroes could hold harmful beliefs, and how even the most charming and talented people could still reflect the biases of their time. It also shows how difficult it was for one man, even one as respected as Johnny Carson, to navigate these cultural shifts while staying entertaining, welcoming, and neutral on national television. Carson never claimed to be a political activist, and he rarely used his platform to take bold stands. But his quiet discomfort, his subtle distancing, and his refusal to feed into hateful humor became their own kind of response. Without shouting, he signaled which direction America was heading. He didn't always get it right, and sometimes he let problematic comments slide too easily, but his body language often said more than words could. In the end, The Tonight Show became not only a stage for comedy and entertainment but also a mirror reflecting the flaws, contradictions, and changing values of American society. Johnny Carson never confronted Hope directly about his racially insensitive jokes. Instead, he used quiet redirection. Whenever Hope drifted into old-fashioned jokes that no longer felt funny, Johnny simply shifted the conversation to something safer. He smiled politely, but inside he knew those jokes had aged badly. This captured the dilemma Carson faced. He respected Hope as a comedy legend, yet he understood that much of Hope's humor had become offensive to many people. So Carson played it safe: tight smiles, quick topic changes, and subtle signals that he didn't want the conversation going any further. Hope's situation mattered because it showed a bigger tension in American entertainment. How do you honor the past without ignoring the harm it caused? Hope gave decades of entertainment, supported American troops, and shaped comedy history. But his success also included jokes built on racist stereotypes that hurt real communities. That contradiction, great contributions mixed with real harm, was something Carson never fully solved on The Tonight Show. Hope defended his old style of comedy long after society had changed. To him, criticism wasn't about racism, it was an attack on comedy itself. This attitude was common among older entertainers who believed people had become too sensitive. Carson, stuck between respecting Hope's legacy and acknowledging new standards, took a middle path. He neither challenged Hope nor fully ignored the issue. His careful balancing act reflected how incomplete America's racial reckoning still was during his era. Charlton Heston was another complicated guest. Heston was one of the most recognized actors in Hollywood, starring in films like The Ten Commandments, Ben-Hur, Planet of the Apes, and Soylent Green. His powerful voice and heroic screen presence made him a cultural giant. But as he became more politically outspoken, especially during his leadership of the National Rifle Association, his public comments about race grew more controversial. Critics noted that he often dismissed modern civil rights concerns and talked about racism as if it were already solved. Carson adapted his approach as Heston's political identity grew louder. He remained polite, as he always did with guests, but behind the scenes he instructed writers to steer Heston away from political topics. Carson knew that if the conversation drifted toward race or civil rights, Heston was likely to express views that many Americans would find offensive. Instead of confronting him, Johnny filled segments with movie nostalgia and light topics. This wasn't unusual for Carson. He preferred to keep The Tonight Show fun, not political. But with Heston, there was added pressure. His private off-camera remarks were sometimes even more dismissive of civil rights leaders, occasionally dipping into stereotypes. Staff members who heard these conversations grew uneasy, because they saw a huge gap between the noble heroes Heston played on screen and the insensitive comments he made about modern movements for racial equality. Carson never addressed this contradiction openly, but his behavior subtly changed. He kept the interviews cordial, not warm. He gently redirected conversations. He avoided topics that might expose Heston's more problematic beliefs. This indirect technique showed how difficult it was to deal with guests whose racial insensitivity came not from slurs, but from minimizing real issues. It required a kind of soft steering rather than a dramatic confrontation. Don Rickles was a completely different kind of challenge. His entire career was built on insult comedy, and he intentionally said things that no one else could get away with, including racial and ethnic jokes that would have ended another comedian's career. His act was full of stereotypes, slurs, and boundary-breaking insults. And yet he somehow maintained friendships with people he insulted on stage, including Sammy Davis Jr., who Rickles famously called a spear chucker during a performance. Carson genuinely liked Rickles, which made things more complicated. They were friends. Rickles made Johnny laugh in ways few others could. But Carson also knew that times had changed. A staff member once recalled Carson warning producers, "If he says that word again, we're cutting to commercial." It showed that Carson understood exactly how dangerous Rickles' language could be on live television. So Carson walked a tightrope. He allowed Rickles more freedom than almost any other guest, but he also enforced certain invisible lines. Rickles' defenders argue he insulted everyone equally. Critics argue that equal opportunity offense isn't truly equal when jokes reinforce real-world inequalities. Insulting a powerful white actor for his hair isn't the same as insulting a minority guest's racial identity. Even if Rickles didn't mean it, the impact was still there. Carson's handling of Rickles showed the inconsistencies of the time. Standards were changing, but exceptions were made for beloved performers. Carson set boundaries, but also bent them because of personal affection and Rickles' long-standing reputation. Burt Reynolds presented yet another kind of challenge. He was charming, attractive, funny, and enormously popular. But occasionally, because of his upbringing in the segregated South, he made racially insensitive jokes, usually not intentionally, but out of habit. These weren't constant, like with some guests, but isolated remarks that stood out against his generally warm personality. One appearance in 1978 sparked hundreds of viewer complaints after Reynolds made stereotypical jokes about Native Americans. At a time when complaints required writing a physical letter, this was significant. Carson responded by quietly removing the segment from reruns for years. He didn't shame Reynolds publicly or confront him on air. Instead, he protected the audience from outdated humor and protected Reynolds from backlash. Reynolds wasn't seen as malicious, just unaware. His case showed how old attitudes sometimes slipped out even from people considered progressive for their time. His charm made the missteps more disappointing, because viewers expected better from him. Red Skelton represented an even older era. He came from a time when blackface was standard entertainment and racist caricatures were part of mainstream comedy. Skelton had built his early career on these traditions, but unlike some entertainers, he refused to acknowledge that anything was wrong with them. Well into the 1970s and 80s, he defended minstrel-style humor and criticized networks for being too sensitive. Carson respected Skelton deeply. Skelton was one of the giants he grew up watching. But when Skelton complained about not being allowed to use racial stereotypes, Carson's responses were polite but distant. He would give a quick, unenthusiastic acknowledgement and move to another topic. The audience reaction said even more. Jokes that once earned laughter now produced silence or discomfort. Skelton interpreted this as political correctness, not progress. But the shift reflected a real change in American society. People were starting to reject entertainment built on racial stereotypes. Carson never solved these contradictions. He respected tradition, but also saw the harm in some of it. He didn't confront guests directly, but he also didn't let the show become an unfiltered platform for outdated views. His quiet redirects, careful topic changes, and behind-the-scenes decisions formed a pattern. Protect the show, avoid conflict, and gently guide conversations away from damaging material. It was a reflection of America at the time, caught between honoring its entertainment history and finally beginning to understand the harm that history had caused.